Hercules was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. Alcmene was married to Amphitryon, the heir to the throne of Tiryns. But Alcmene refused to consummate her marriage until Amphitryon had avenged the murder of her brothers, who had been killed by the Taphian pirates. So before even sleeping with his wife, Amphitryon traveled to the Taphian Islands and stayed there for several weeks until he had killed all of the Taphian pirates. On the night before Amphitryon returned from his journey, Zeus came to Alcmene in the form and shape of her husband. He told her that he had just come home from killing the pirates. Alcmene was overjoyed and gladly allowed him into her bed. The next day, when the real Amphitryon returned home, he wondered why she did not give him a hero's welcome. After speaking with his wife, he discovered the truth. Alcmene had spent the previous night with someone else. Amphitryon did not believe Alcmene's story, that the man she had been with had looked and sounded exactly like him. But the seer Tiresias told him that the interloper had been Zeus himself, and that Alcmene's story was true. Now Amphitryon believed her, and they finally consummated their marriage. When Hera discovered that Alcmene was pregnant with Zeus's child, she was very unhappy, needless to say. When Alcmene went into labor, Hera sent Eileithyia to prevent the birth from taking place. Eileithyia sat outside the delivery room crossing her fingers and legs, which halted the delivery. Alcmene, who was pregnant with twin boys, was in a bad state and was close to breathing her last breath when her nurse, Galanthus, came up with a trick to break Eileithyia's spell. She shouted that the baby had already come. Eileithyia, in confusion as to how this could have happened, jumped up and broke her spell, allowing Alcmene to deliver 2 baby boys. In her anger at being tricked, Eileithyia turned Galanthus into a weasel. The 2 babies were named Iphicles and Heracles, but the parents did not know which one of their sons was Zeus's child and which one was the child of Amphitryon. Hera did not leave Heracles alone for long. When he was about 18 months old, she sent 2 snakes to kill both Iphicles and Heracles while they were sleeping in their crib. While Iphicles screamed in terror and cowered in the corner, Heracles grabbed hold of the snakes and strangled one in each hand. Any doubt as to which was the son of Zeus and which the son of Amphitryon was solved by this event. As he grew, Heracles learned many important skills from great teachers, but he had a short temper and did not realize his own strength. When his music teacher, Linus, who was the brother of Orpheus, reprimanded him for not practicing enough, Heracles took his chair and smashed it over Linus's head, killing him instantly. Amphitryon decided to send Heracles to live at his country estate to protect his family. By the time Heracles was 17, he had grown to be a tall and strong youth. Around the same time, a lion was roaming in the area of Mount Cithaeron and was terrorizing the countryside. Thespius, the king of the area, asked Heracles to come and stay with him and help his men kill the lion. Thespius also happened to have 50 daughters. For 50 days, Heracles went out to find the lion, and each night Thespius sent a different daughter in to sleep with Heracles, though Heracles thought it was the same daughter each night. After the 50 days, Heracles had killed the lion, and all of Thespius's 50 daughters were pregnant. Heracles stayed in the area of Thebes long enough to distinguish himself in a war the Thebans were fighting against a people called the Minyans. The king of Thebes was so happy to have had Heracles' help that he offered his daughter, Megara, to Heracles as a wife. Megara and Heracles married and had 2 sons. They lived for a few years in peace, but Hera was still out to torment Heracles, so she sent Madness to drive him mad. In his madness, Heracles killed his wife and children. When he regained his sanity, Heracles was devastated and decided to go to the oracle at Delphi to ask Apollo how he could be purified for this murder. As a punishment for the murder of his own children, Heracles was told by the Pythia that he had to perform 12 tasks for Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns. Eurystheus was also king of Mycenae. Eurystheus had inherited the throne of Mycenae from his father, Sthenelus, who had usurped it from Amphitryon, Heracles' mortal father. So Heracles should really have been king of Mycenae instead of Eurystheus. Heracles had to perform any 12 tasks that Eurystheus set for him, even though Eurystheus had usurped Heracles' throne. and was neither as strong or as brave as Heracles was. This subordinate relationship to Eurystheus was humiliating for Heracles, and that was no doubt part of the punishment. The first 6 of Heracles' labors take place in the Peloponnese. The last 6 labors take place throughout the Greek world. Eurystheus first told Heracles to kill the lion that had been terrorizing the area of Nemea. This lion was no ordinary lion. It was the offspring of Typhoeus. Heracles tracked the Nemean lion to its cave, blocked off the entrance, and tried to kill the lion by shooting it with his bow and arrows. But the arrows bounced right off the lion's hide, doing the animal no harm. Undeterred, Heracles used brute force to strangle the beast and brought the lion back to Tiryns for Eurystheus. Eurystheus, surprised that Heracles had survived the adventure, became very fearful of Heracles. Because Eurystheus did not want the lion, Heracles skinned it and used the hide as a cloak, with the lion's head serving as a sort of helmet. The lion's skin became Heracles' trademark, and he wore it on all his future endeavors. Next, Eurystheus sent Heracles to kill the Hydra. The Hydra was a sea monster. Its name comes from Hydor, which means water in Greek, that had many snake-like heads. The Hydra lived in a swampy area near Lerna, and Heracles came to its den. He engaged the Hydra by grabbing at one of the heads and hacking at it with his sword until the head was severed from the body. But as soon as Heracles had cut off the Hydra's head, 2 more heads grew in its place. At this point, Heracles realized that simply cutting off the Hydra's heads was not going to work. He also realized that he could not kill the Hydra alone, so he called Iolaus, his charioteer, to bring a burning brand so he could cauterize the neck to prevent new heads from growing back after Heracles cut off each head. Heracles and Iolaus managed to destroy each head and burn the neck for all the Hydra's heads until just one head, which was immortal, survived. This head he buried beneath a giant rock. The Hydra's blood was a deadly poison, so Heracles dipped his arrows in the blood to make sure that anyone he hit would die of his wound. Heracles would one day regret that the Hydra's blood was so deadly. Eurystheus then sent Heracles to capture the Ceryneian hind, a deer with golden horns that was sacred to the goddess Artemis. Because the deer was sacred to Artemis, Heracles could not kill it. He had to capture it alive. For a year he tracked the deer, which was the fastest deer in the world, around the forests of the Peloponnese. He finally captured it in Arcadia, when it had paused for a little rest by creeping up behind it and surprising it. On his way back to Tiryns, Heracles encountered Apollo and Artemis hunting. Artemis was not happy to find her sacred deer so constrained, but after he explained his task, Artemis allowed Heracles to take the deer so long as it remained unharmed and would be released after he was finished with it. After the Ceryneian hind had been released, Heracles had to capture the Erymanthian boar, which was ravaging the countryside around Mount Erymanthus and doing a lot of damage to the crops. On his way to find the Erymanthian boar, Heracles met Pholus, a centaur who, unlike his fellow centaurs, was quite well-mannered. Pholus hosted Heracles like a proper guest and offered him some wine. This wine was noticed by the other centaurs, however, who are notorious for loving wine, but also for being unable to hold their liquor. When the centaurs smelled the wine, they went crazy and started attacking Heracles and Pholus in order to steal it. The two successfully drove the centaurs away, but in the process, Pholus dropped one of Heracles' arrows on his foot and, unfortunately, the Hydra's poison caused him to die in agony. This is yet another example of Heracles hurting anyone who gets too close to him. In this case, it was an accident, but it was no less deadly for Pholus. After this unfortunate incident, Heracles caught up with the Erymanthian boar and trapped it by driving it into deep snow. He brought the boar back alive to Tiryns to show to Eurystheus. But Eurystheus was so frightened of the enormous beast that he hid in a large storage jar called a pythos, and only peeked out a little so he could verify that Heracles had completed his task. At this point, word had spread throughout Greece that Jason was looking for the greatest Greek heroes to go with him on an expedition for the Golden Fleece. Heracles took a break from his labors to join the crew. However, he did not make the entire journey to Colchis. The Argonauts left Heracles behind in Mysia while he searched for his lover Hylas. Unable to find Hylas, Hercules returned to Tiryns for his next labor. The next task Eurystheus had for Hercules was to clean the Augean stables in one day. Augeas was king of Elis, and he had massive stables that had never been cleaned, so they were filled with many years' worth of dung. Hercules came to Augeas and told him that he could clean out the stables in one day if he paid the right sum, 1/10 of his cattle. Augeas agreed, and Hercules set to work. He diverted the courses of 2 rivers so they flowed right through the stables and washed away the years of filth. Augeas had not believed Hercules could perform the task, so he refused to pay the outrageous sum. Hercules was livid, but at this point there was nothing he could do, so he went back to Tiryns. Next, Hercules was sent to clear away the Stymphalian birds. Lake Stymphalus was overrun by a flock of man-eating birds. Hercules decided that a loud noise would be just the thing, so he crashed a few shields together to scare the birds into taking flight. As the birds flew into the air, he picked them off one by one with his arrows. Hercules was then sent to capture the Cretan bull. This bull was the father of the Minotaur, and Hercules trapped it and brought it back to Tiryns alive. Eurystheus did not want it, so Hercules let the bull go. The bull wandered up to the area around Athens, and Theseus later killed him as one of his heroic feats. The 8th labor required Hercules to retrieve the mares of Diomedes. Diomedes was a Thracian king, and he had man-eating mares. Hercules, with the help of his lover Abderus, stole the mares from their stable and herded them down to the seashore. Diomedes' men were in hot pursuit, so he left Abderus to take care of the mares while he dispatched with Diomedes and routed his men. When Hercules came back, however, he found that the mares had eaten most of Abderus. Hercules was upset at the death of his lover, and he carefully buried Abderus's remains. He then gathered the mares into his ship and took them back to Eurystheus. Again, Eurystheus did not want the terrible creatures in his city, so Hercules let the mares loose. They were eventually eaten by wild animals as they wandered on Mount Olympus. For his next labor, Hercules had to retrieve the belt of the Amazon queen, Hippolyte. Hippolyte and the Amazons lived in Themyscira on the southern coast of the Black Sea. Hercules was joined on this expedition by his friend Theseus, and they set off together. When they reached Themyscira, Hippolyte came aboard their ship to meet with them. She agreed to give them her belt with no fight, and everything seemed to be going swimmingly for Hercules and Theseus. However, Hera was not about to allow this labor to be easy, so she came down from Olympus, disguised as an Amazon. Hera told the Amazons that Hercules was kidnapping their queen, and she roused them to fight the heroes. Being angry because he believed the whole thing had been a setup, Hercules killed Hippolyte and left with Theseus, taking Hippolyte's sister, Antiope, and the belt. Other versions say that Hippolyte was not killed at all, but that she was the one whom Theseus took with him to Athens, where she became the mother of Theseus's son Hippolytus. Next, Heracles was sent to steal the cattle of Geryon, who was the king of Erythea. Geryon had 3 heads and 3 upper bodies as well as 6 arms and 6 legs. Furthermore, his cattle were guarded by a 2-headed watchdog named Orthus. Heracles decided to go through Africa to make his way to Spain, and as he crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, he set up large rocks on either side, called the Pillars of Heracles, to show how far he had come across the world. The sun beat down upon him, greatly annoying Heracles, so he drew his bow and pointed it at the sun, chastising it. Helios, the sun god, was amused by this little stunt, so he lent his golden cup to Heracles to use as a boat to take him the rest of his way to Erythea. When he arrived, Heracles dispatched of Geryon and Orthus. Nearly done with his labors, Heracles now went to retrieve the apples of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were nymphs who lived in Libya near the mountains where Atlas held up the world, now called the Atlas Mountains, and tended a garden growing golden apples. On his way there, Heracles passed by the Caucasus Mountains and shot the eagle that had long tortured Prometheus, freeing him from his bonds. Grateful for his help, Prometheus gave Heracles some advice as to how to retrieve the apples. Prometheus told Heracles to ask Atlas, who happened to be Prometheus's own brother, to go get the apples. Hercules heeded his advice and asked Atlas to get the apples while he held up the world. Atlas was happy to retrieve the apples, but he had no intention of returning to his post. When he returned with the apples, Atlas offered to take them to Eurystheus for Hercules, intending to never return. But Hercules knew what Atlas was planning. He made a show of agreeing to Atlas's plan, but he asked the Titan to hold the world just for a minute, so he could place a pad on his shoulders to make the task more bearable. Atlas took the world onto his shoulders again, and Hercules picked up the apples and went back to Tiryns. After he had shown them to Eurystheus, he gave them to Athena, and she, in turn, returned them to the Hesperides. Heracles' final labor was to bring Cerberus back from Hades. Of course, he could not kill the three-headed dog in the process. Heracles began this labor by being initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. Then, Hermes led him down into the underworld. In Hades, Heracles saw his friends, Theseus and Pirithous, stuck to chairs, and they begged Heracles to set them free. Heracles managed to pry Theseus loose and began to move on to Pirithous, but the earth began to shake, and Heracles desisted. Heracles and Theseus were allowed to leave, but Hades insisted that Pirithous remain. When Heracles came to Hades' palace, he asked the ruler of the underworld if he could take Cerberus with him. Hades agreed, as long as Heracles did not use weapons to capture him. Heracles grabbed the hellhound and dragged him all the way to Tiryns. Eurystheus hid as soon as he saw Cerberus, and, from his hiding place, ordered that he be taken back to Hades, and Heracles obliged. With all the labors completed, Heracles was now free to go about his life as he wished. After these 12 labors, Heracles set out, looking for a new wife with whom he could start over. Eurytus of Oechalia, who had taught Heracles how to shoot a bow and arrow, was looking for a husband for his daughter, Iole. Eurytus had set up the condition that whoever could beat him in an archery contest would win Iole, and Heracles won easily. However, Eurytus knew about the misfortunes Heracles had had with Megara, and refused to give Iole to Heracles. Heracles was furious, but at this point, there was nothing he could do. At the same time this was happening, some of Eurytus's mares went missing. Sources vary on whether Heracles had anything to do with the disappearance. Eurytus's son, Iphitus, who believed Heracles was innocent, went with Heracles to find the mares. The two eventually ended up in Tiryns at Heracles' house. After they located the mares, the two friends were drinking on the roof of Heracles' house. What happened after that is not clear, but somehow they got into an argument, and Heracles ended up throwing Iphitus from the roof. Heracles was stricken with a disease as punishment for his crime. When he consulted the Delphic oracle, the Pythia told Heracles that he had to sell himself as a slave for 3 years for whatever price Iphitus's sons established. Omphale Heracles did as the Pythia said, and he was sold to Omphale, the queen and ruler of Lydia, who had inherited power from her late husband. The kingdom of Lydia had some enemies, and now that Omphale had control of the kingdom, those enemies took the opportunity to cause problems. Heracles used his strength and fortitude to solve these problems for Omphale, who was incredibly grateful. She freed Heracles, and the disease left him. After many years and many adventures, Heracles found himself in Calydon, where he fell in love with King Oeneus's daughter, Deianira. Heracles had a rival for her hand, though, in Achelous, a local river god. The two fought until Heracles managed to break off one of the god's horns, which caused the god to yield. Heracles and Deianira married, but they were not able to live happily very long. Heracles, still not aware of his strength, killed Oeneus's cupbearer when he gave the boy a quick blow as punishment for some offense. Oeneus forgave his son-in-law, but Heracles, in his guilt, insisted that he go into exile for his crime. Heracles left Calydon with Deianira in tow. At some point in their trip, Heracles and Deianira came to a very deep and very large lake. Heracles could easily swim across the lake, but Deianira could not, and Heracles could not carry her while swimming across. Just at that time, the centaur Nessus approached the newlyweds and offered to ferry Deianira across the river. Heracles gratefully agreed to let Nessus swim across the river carrying Deianira on his back. Halfway across the lake, however, Nessus began to rape Deianira. Heracles heard her screams and shot off one of his arrows dipped in the Hydra's blood. Of course, the arrow hit its mark and, as Nessus knew, Hydra's blood was a deadly poison. But Nessus decided to get back at Heracles, even though he would not live to see his revenge. As he lay dying, Nessus told Deianira that if she took some of his blood and wiped it on a robe for Heracles to wear, it would act as a love potion. Of course, this was a lie. Deianira was aware of her husband's wandering affections, so she collected some of Nessus's blood and kept it, in case she ever had need of it. She had no idea that the deadly Hydra poison was also a part of her love potion. Deianira was justified in her suspicions of her husband, although nothing happened right away. But many years later, Heracles decided to get revenge on Eurytus, who had refused to give Heracles his daughter, Iole, in marriage. Heracles killed Eurytus and his sons in battle and brought Iole back home to be his concubine. Deianira knew about her husband's many affairs, but she did not want to live in the same house with a younger rival. So she decided to put Nessus's plan into action. She smeared Nessus's blood on a beautiful new robe and gave it to her husband when he returned home, bringing Iole with him. Heracles put on the handsome robe to give a thanksgiving offering to Zeus for a successful return home. But as soon as he put on the robe, his skin immediately caught fire. When Heracles tried to take off the robe, parts of his skin came off with it, and Heracles continued to burn. Realizing the terrible mistake she had made, Deianira took her own life. But Heracles was in agony. He could not take off the robe because it was sticking to his skin, but he could not put out the fire. And Heracles was burning so slowly that it seemed to be taking forever for him to die. Heracles decided to end his life as soon as possible. He took his son Hylas up into the mountains and asked him to build a funeral pyre. Hylas agreed to build the pyre, but he refused to light it because he could not bear to end his father's life. A passing shepherd and his son, Philoctetes, agreed to light the pyre, and so Heracles gave his famous bow and arrows to Philoctetes. The fire burned away Heracles' mortal flesh, and he became immortal. He was taken up to Olympus to live with the other gods, and he married his half-sister Hebe. And Hera finally put aside her anger against him. It seems that Heracles could only find peace after his death. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and labors of Hercules. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mythological and historical tales. Until next time.